Tonight, picture yourself standing in the echoing stone hall of Whitehall Palace, the candles trembling as if they know a secret no one alive dares to speak aloud. In an age where one wrong glance could cost a man his life, where kings ruled through fear and blood and spectacle, there existed a man who defied every law of survival. A man who married the King of England's sister in secret, who challenged the temper of the most dangerous monarch in Europe, who abandoned wives, betrayed allies, provoked queens, survived purges, dodged execution after execution, and somehow died peacefully in his own bed with his titles, fortune, and head still attached. His name was Charles Brandon, and his existence should not have been possible. This wasn't an ordinary story of courtly ambition. This was a story about a man who walked directly into the furnace of Tudor power and never burned. A man who angered Henry VIII in ways so catastrophic that anyone else would have been dragged through the streets, tried for treason, and left rotting on a pike. Yet Henry, the same king who executed brilliant statesmen, beloved wives, old friends, and young rivals without hesitation, always stopped short of killing Brandon. He couldn't bring himself to do it. It was as though Brandon lived under some unnatural protection, a charm woven from charm itself. And the strangest part is this: Charles Brandon wasn't virtuous. He wasn't noble of heart. He wasn't loyal in any meaningful sense. He survived because he understood Henry in a way no one else did understood, that the king didn't want honesty or morality or even true friendship. He wanted reflection. He wanted mirrors. And Brandon became the perfect mirror, empty enough to show Henry exactly what he wanted to see, flexible enough to twist into whatever the king needed, shameless enough to sacrifice anything: women, allies, principles, truth for one goal: survival. Around Brandon formed a circle the world would later call the Tudor Brat Pack, a gathering of young men who shaped the early reign of Henry VIII in ways invisible yet colossal. William Compton, the silent keeper of the king's most intimate secrets. Anthony Knivet, the warrior who could match Henry in the tilt yard without humiliating him. And Charles Brandon, reckless beyond measure, the one who pushed boundaries until they shattered, the one who took risks that bordered on suicidal, the one Henry forgave again and again when forgiveness made no sense. But the moment that defined Brandon's legend came in the year 1515, when he committed an act that was not metaphorically treason, not socially treason, but legally treason punishable by death without debate. He married Mary Tudor, the king's sister, in France in secret, only weeks after she became a widow. No permission, no negotiation, no hesitation. The law said he had to die. The court believed he would die. Brandon himself believed he would die, and yet he didn't. He lived. He paid a crushing fine. He groveled. He crawled. But he lived. And not only lived, he returned to court, returned to favor, returned to the center of power as though nothing had happened at all. The entire political world watched in disbelief as the impossible unfolded. The king, who executed people for refusing to sign a document, forgave the man who stole his sister. This was the moment the court understood something terrifying. Charles Brandon wasn't merely lucky. He was dangerous. He was the one man in England who could betray the king and walk away breathing. From there, his life became a long corridor of morally rotten choices, hidden behind polite smiles. He abandoned one wife. He manipulated the marriage of another. He stole a girl who was engaged to his own son. He supported the downfall of Thomas More. He supported the execution of Anne Boleyn, whom he openly hated, and felt satisfaction as the sword fell. He betrayed Thomas Cromwell, who had been a partner in power for years. He stood by every purge, every shift, every violent flex of Henry's will, never resisting, never questioning, never risking anything except other people's lives. The strangest, darkest truth in all of this is that Brandon did not survive because he was good. He survived because he learned how to erase himself, because he learned that in the orbit of absolute power, identity is optional, integrity is optional, even conscience is optional. The only thing that matters is usefulness. And Brandon perfected the art of being useful even when he was empty inside. By the time Henry VIII finally died, bloated, infected, paranoid, rotting from within, Brandon was already gone, having slipped quietly into death 2 years earlier, untouched by the collapse that swallowed everyone else. He did not live to see the chaos that followed. He did not have to navigate the terror of Edward VI's brief reign. He escaped before the storm he had helped create consumed the kingdom. And so this story isn't just about a man who lived too long, it's about what a man must trade away to survive. It's about the cost of proximity to unchecked power. It's about how a human being becomes a reflection instead of a self. Over the next 9 parts, you'll step inside the machinery of Tudor fear through Brandon's childhood, his rise, his marriages, his betrayals, his enemies, his survival strategies, the destruction he witnessed, and the pieces of himself he carved away one by one. And by the end of this journey, you'll face the same question his life asks. Is survival still victory if the price is your soul? When you trace the beginning of Charles Brandon's ascent, you must picture a boy standing alone in a world that was never designed for him, a child connected to royalty only by the moment his father died, carrying the Tudor banner at Bosworth. Because that death, as grim and senseless as any battlefield sacrifice in those raw years of England's civil conflict, became the golden thread Henry VII's court used to tie his son to the crown's household. Not out of affection, but out of convenience. Because taking in the orphan of a fallen standard-bearer made the king appear benevolent while ensuring that young Charles would grow up inside the machinery of power without ever truly belonging to it. He learned quickly what it meant to be present yet invisible, to hold privilege without authority, to move through rooms gilded in gold while never forgetting that the blood in his veins was not noble blood, that he was there because someone else had died, that his future depended entirely on whether he could become useful to people who would never consider him an equal. And in that environment, the boy began perfecting the instinct that would later define his life, the ability to read power the way a sailor reads wind. Not through logic, but through sensation, through instinct, through the subtle shifts in temperature that signal when a storm is coming. It was inside those vast chambers and long corridors where he first met the young Prince Henry, who was not yet the monster history remembers, not yet the father of tyranny, but an eager, laughing boy with far too much energy and far too little responsibility. The kind of child who sought adventure and sunlight and noise. And Brandon, only a couple of years older, became the perfect companion for him, close enough in age to compete and play, humble enough in rank to never threaten, and skilled enough in physical pursuits to impress without overshadowing. They learned to ride together, to wield wooden practice swords, to race across palace yards, to dream of the heroic futures boys always dream of before reality teaches them what heroism actually costs. And as the prince grew, Brandon grew with him, not quite friend, not quite servant, something strange in between, a presence the prince came to depend on before he ever understood why. When Arthur, the elder brother, died in the year 1502, and Henry transformed overnight from a secondary figure into the heir to the throne, the court reshaped itself around him like metal bending under heat, and Charles Brandon, still technically a ward, found himself caught in that gravitational pull, no longer merely a companion, but a fixture inside the prince's emerging world. One of the few people who had known Henry before the crown cast its long shadow. The shifting tides of political attention did not erase the bond formed in youth. In fact, they solidified it, turning childhood familiarity into political capital. Brandon never consciously planned to use but learned instinctively how to wield. Because in a court where everyone wore masks, the memory of an unmasked childhood became a kind of currency, and Charles held more of it than anyone else. When Henry VII died and the 17-year-old Henry became king, bright as a torch and twice as dangerous, he sought not the sober statesman who had served his father, but the vibrant cluster of young men who made him feel invincible. Men who rode and jousted and drank with the recklessness of youth. And Brandon slipped seamlessly into that inner ring because he had been there before it even existed. The court was suddenly a carnival of masculine display, of tournaments staged with dazzling brutality, of nights spent carousing until dawn, of banquets where excess was not merely accepted, but celebrated as proof of royal vitality. And Charles thrived in that atmosphere, because this was a world built on momentum rather than merit, on charisma rather than lineage, and he possessed both in abundance even if he lacked the pedigree that old nobles clung to like armor. Yet beneath the glitter, beneath the trumpets and velvet and embroidered banners, lay something darker. A truth Charles absorbed instinctively. Proximity to the king was not a privilege but a peril, one that demanded unwavering attention to the king's desires, shifting mood, and unpredictable impulses. He watched how men angling for favor presented themselves, how they tailored their every gesture to match the king's preferences, how they made themselves reflections rather than individuals. And he learned that the quickest path upward often required the softest footprint. The old aristocracy bristled at his rise, whispering that he was a handsome opportunist with no ancient blood to justify his swift ascent, and they weren't wrong. Yet they missed the point entirely, because Charles understood Henry's psychology in a way that those pedigreed families never could. He knew that the king, still intoxicated by youthful dreams of chivalric glory and desperate to escape the oppressive legacy of his father's paranoia, wanted companions who made him feel unburdened, who made him feel powerful, who never reminded him of the weight of kingship unless he asked for it, and Brandon honed that role with exquisite precision. The difference between them became clear in small moments, in the way Henry's temper cooled around him, in the way the king felt taller, stronger, more admired when Brandon stood nearby. And Charles soon discovered that being a mirror required a strange kind of emptiness, a willingness to step into whatever shape the king needed that day, whether it was a rival in sport or a brother in laughter or a quiet shadow in moments of grief. And in that flexibility, he became indispensable, not because he offered guidance or challenge, but because he offered ease. The king's other companions came and went, some fading, some failing, some falling to illness or political miscalculation. But Brandon endured because he understood that survival required him to never be too bold, never too passive, never too visible, never too absent, never too independent, never too submissive, always calibrated to the precise emotional temperature of the king's inner world. In those early years, their companionship seemed harmless, even wholesome, a reflection of the natural momentum of two young men intoxicated by privilege and possibility. Yet even then, the seeds of danger were already rooted, because the closer one stood to Henry VIII, the more one became shaped by forces larger and darker than youth could comprehend. The king's desire for glory hardened into ambition. His need for affirmation deepened into dependency. And the boy who once raced across palace lawns became a man whose need to be adored would one day cost thousands their lives. Charles did not see the full shape of that future yet, but he felt tremors of it, subtle at first, hints in Henry's hunger for admiration, in the way he gravitated toward those who made him feel noble, righteous, divinely chosen, and in the way he recoiled from anyone who denied that illusion. Charles learned too that power did not always announce itself. Often it whispered, concealed beneath silk and trumpet blasts, hidden behind a smile, waiting until the perfect moment to pull even the boldest souls into its jaws. And though he didn't know it yet, he was already drifting into a destiny that would require him to shed every layer of himself that could not survive inside a court that thrived on fear, suspicion, and sacrifice. By the time he recognized that Henry's favor was less a shield than a tether, it was too late. He was already bound to the king's orbit, already shaped by that gravitational pull, already committed to a life in which his survival depended on his ability to please a man whose moods changed with the speed of a gathering storm. What Charles did not yet understand, as he watched the early years of Henry's reign unfold in a blaze of celebration and reckless optimism, was that every victory, every triumph, every moment of camaraderie was also tightening the trap around him. The king was becoming addicted to applause, addicted to being reflected in the eyes of men who adored him, addicted to the illusion of heroic destiny, and Brandon, standing nearest to the center of that furnace, would one day discover that the same warmth that fed him could just as easily incinerate him if he misstepped even once. For now, though, he drifted deeper into the glow of a king who believed himself invincible, unaware that the cost of living so close to radiance is that you begin to vanish in its light. As the rhythm of court life settled into a pattern of tournaments, hunts, feasts, and endless spectacles designed to nourish the king's hunger for admiration, Charles Brandon began to discover that the glow of royal favor did not protect a man as much as it exposed him, because every smile exchanged with Henry became a point of envy for the nobility. Every role he was entrusted with marked him as a competitor to men born into generational power, and each reward that fell into his lap carved another notch of resentment into the hearts of families whose bloodlines stretched back to the age of Normans. Yet in those early years of Henry's reign, Charles was too absorbed in the intoxicating closeness of the king to notice the gathering hostility, the way eyes lingered on him too long across the tilt yard, the way whispers shifted whenever he entered a chamber, or the way older lords clenched their jaws as the upstart ward of the crown galloped past them in armor, encrusted with gold that he had earned not through inheritance, but through Henry's affection. Still, the young king's world was full of noise and movement and grand illusions, and Brandon moved with it effortlessly, becoming a fixture at Henry's side, not because he was commanded to be, but because the king, having spent his youth overshadowed by the legacy of his father's suspicion, craved companionship that made him feel human rather than merely sovereign. Charles filled that void naturally. He understood when to challenge Henry in sport, when to concede in jest, when to compliment without groveling, and when to vanish before the king's temper, still tame. In those years began its slow descent into the volatility that would one day terrify even the boldest men in England. But even as Charles thrived, threads of danger wove themselves quietly through the seams of his life. For the court was never a single stage, it was a labyrinth, and every room held a different set of expectations, alliances, and traps. The first of these traps came not from his rivals, but from his own nature, because the same daring that made him charming also made him reckless, and the same confidence that won him titles also led him to choices that tethered him to consequences far more perilous than he yet understood. His early entanglements with women, still hidden beneath the surface of official records, began revealing the contours of a man who chased desire with the same abandon he chased royal favor, weaving a trail of fragile vows, questionable contracts, and quietly broken promises. In a world where marriage was not merely personal but political, every union became a statement, and every dissolution became a stain. Yet Charles moved through these delicate territories with the ease of someone who trusted that the king's fondness for him would always smooth the damage he left behind. He married, separated, annulled, remarried, and renegotiated his way through a web of relationships that should have destroyed any man who was not swaddled in the strange protection of royal affection. Anne Brown, whose presence would later become a footnote in the narrative of his ascent, became in those days both evidence of his charm and casualty of his ambition, because Charles treated marriage as a hinge he could swing open or shut depending on where opportunity beckoned, claiming pre-contracts when they benefited him and dismissing them when they did not, leaving behind a blur of confusion and legal uncertainty that might have enraged the court if not for the king's persistent disinterest in the morality of his friends. To Henry VIII, Charles's romantic chaos was not a problem, but a form of entertainment, a reminder that life could still be spirited and unpredictable in the gilded cage of monarchy. And so the king laughed while others whispered, and Charles learned that as long as Henry laughed, consequences were a distant threat rather than an imminent danger. But the court watched, the old families watched, the counselors watched, the church watched. And though Charles appeared oblivious to their simmering disdain, the pressure accumulated in the shadows, waiting for the moment when his charm alone would no longer be enough to shield him from the judgments he was accumulating like debts. He did not feel this yet, because he was floating through the king's orbit like a favored satellite, never quite realizing that the closer he drifted to Henry's rising star, the more catastrophic the fall would be when gravity turned against him. For now, though, he reveled in his ascension, believing perhaps sincerely, perhaps foolishly, that he could climb indefinitely without ever losing his footing. The breadth of his responsibilities expanded quickly, because Henry wanted his youth surrounded by movement, and Charles excelled at orchestrating the types of displays that made the king's identity feel true. From lavish tournaments to staged hunts to diplomatic pageants where Henry could perform the role he had crafted for himself, a warrior king in the model of Edward III. And in this service, Charles discovered another truth about the king. Henry valued not the men who cautioned him, not the ones who guided him with wisdom or restraint, but those who offered him the world as he wished it to be, who reinforced the illusion that his desires were divine mandates rather than impulses sharpened by adrenaline and pride. Brandon became the embodiment of that reinforcement, not because he set out to deceive the king, but because his entire upbringing had taught him that survival depended on making powerful men comfortable, and Henry, more than any monarch before him, thrived on comfort that disguised itself as loyalty. Yet beneath the noise, the feasts, the jousts, and the camaraderie, the king's world was shifting. The youthful optimism that had defined his early reign was slowly coiling into something tighter, heavier, more expectant of obedience. As he became more confident in his throne, he also became more aware of the fragility of political stability, and that awareness manifested itself in a sharpened need to control his inner circle, to scrutinize the motives of every man who approached him, to test their devotion through increasingly unpredictable outbursts. Charles sensed this subtle transformation not through Henry's words, but through the silences between them, through the sudden pauses when the king's gaze hardened, through the way he began separating his companions into those who entertained him and those who challenged him. And Charles understood instinctively that challenge, even gentle challenge, was becoming an intolerable offense. Still, he stayed close, perhaps because he could imagine no life beyond the king's side, perhaps because he believed his familiarity with Henry's earliest years gave him a kind of immunity, a belief rooted in memory rather than logic, a belief that would one day betray him. For the moment, however, the closeness remained safe, because Henry had not yet learned the taste of blood, not yet discovered the intoxicating relief that came from severing the heads of those who disappointed him, not yet realized how easy it was to erase a man entirely when the crown demanded it. But that change was coming, carried by the winds of foreign alliances, religious tension, and the king's growing fear that fate might deny him the male heir he believed was his divine right. As those pressures gathered, Charles found himself drifting into a new stage of his life, one no longer defined by carefree brotherhood, but by the subtle recalibration of a man learning to survive inside a friend who was turning into a force of nature. The court did not see the shift at first, because it unfolded slowly, like dusk shading into night. But Charles felt it intimately, a new sharpness in Henry's impatience, a new possessiveness in his expectations, a new volatility that made every moment feel slightly off balance. And at the very center of that imbalance, Charles stood both favored and imperiled, tethered to the king by decades of shared memories that were beginning to eclipse into something darker, something hungrier, something that would one day demand from Charles the greatest gamble of his life. For now, he walked beside the king unaware that the quiet tremors beneath their friendship were growing into a fault line, one that would crack open in a foreign palace, in a moment of forbidden vows, in an act so audacious it would nearly cost him everything, including the life he had spent 2 decades shaping through charm, instinct, and delicate obedience. The moment was coming like a shadow rolling toward him, and Charles, dazzled by the present, did not yet realize that every step he took alongside Henry was leading him straight toward it. The moment when Charles Brandon's path finally collided with destiny did not arrive with thunder or spectacle, but crept into his life quietly, wrapped in the soft trappings of royal duty. The kind of assignment that seemed routine at first, an errand for the crown undertaken countless times before. Yet beneath its silk-lined surface lay a razor that would slice through every assumption he had ever made about how far Henry's forgiveness could stretch. It began when the political machinery of Europe turned its gaze toward an alliance that might cool the centuries-old hostility between England and France. A marriage arranged not for affection, but for diplomacy. And the bride chosen to carry the weight of this ambition was Mary Tudor, Henry's younger sister, a woman whose beauty and spirit were spoken of with equal fervor, and whose fate had always been tethered to whatever the kingdom required rather than what she desired. Mary had grown up in the same glittering but suffocating world as her brother. But unlike Henry, who found ways to turn duty into opportunity, she had no such escape. Her body, her future, her very identity existed primarily as a bargaining chip on the chessboard of European politics. She knew as well as anyone that she would be married not for love, but for the fragile peace her union could secure. And when the arrangement with the aging King of France, Louis, whose body had been worn down by illness and decades of rule, became inevitable, Mary did what royal daughters had always done. She bowed her head and prepared to walk into a marriage that felt more like a trial than a partnership. Yet beneath that duty burned a quiet desperation, because Mary, unlike the queens and princesses before her, dared to ask for something in return. She approached her brother with tears and trembling breath and extracted from Henry a promise he should never have made lightly. The promise that once the elderly French king died, she would be free to choose her next husband according to her own heart. This bargain, spoken in the private chambers of a palace that swallowed secrets for breakfast, would later become the hinge on which all their lives turned. For now, Henry agreed because he did not expect the frail French monarch to die so soon, nor did he imagine that his sister's choice would collide so violently with his own authority. Years of being shielded from consequence had given Henry a false confidence in his ability to control fate, and so he waved Mary off to France with a smile that did not yet carry the hardness it would one day hold. Charles Brandon watched all this from the sidelines, unaware that he was already drifting into the center of a storm. He had known Mary for years, long enough to understand her pride, her intelligence, and her fiercely concealed vulnerability, long enough to sense the quiet resentment she held toward a world that reduced her worth to the alliances she could forge with her body. There had always been a spark between them, something unspoken and dangerous. The kind of subterranean bond that grows in the rare spaces where courtly masks momentarily fall away. And though they had never crossed the boundary that separated flirtation from treason, their connection was a restless ember waiting for the right gust of wind. That gust came with startling speed. Louis of France died after only a few months of marriage, leaving Mary a teenage widow stranded in a foreign court that bristled with suspicion, envy, and barely concealed disdain. French nobles hissed that she had worn the old king out, that her youth had consumed him, that she had schemed from the moment she arrived, and Mary, isolated and humiliated, demanded to be brought home at once. Henry, caught between political strategy and familial obligation, dispatched the one man he believed would bring her home safely. That man was Charles Brandon. The moment Henry chose him, a faint unease stirred through the court, because everyone who had watched Mary and Charles dance at feasts, laugh too freely in corridors, or exchange glances that lingered just a breath longer than etiquette allowed, understood the danger of sending a handsome duke into the orbit of a grieving princess who had just been promised the freedom to choose her next husband. But Henry ignored these murmurs, blinded by his belief that Brandon, his closest friend, his most loyal companion, would obey the explicit command he gave before sending him across the channel. Under no circumstances are you to marry my sister? The warning should have been enough to anchor any reasonable man. But Charles Brandon had never been governed by reason. He had always moved through life as though the rules had been written for men other than himself. And when he entered the French court and saw Mary standing there a queen in mourning, stripped of power, clutching the tattered remains of the only promise Henry had ever made her, the weight of that warning began to crumble beneath the pull of something far more potent than loyalty or fear. What happened next would be debated for centuries. Did Mary beg him to defy the king, reminding him of the vow Henry had given her, insisting that she would rather die than be bartered off again like a prize mare? Or did Charles see an opportunity too valuable to ignore? A chance to anchor himself permanently to the royal bloodline. A chance to seize a future where his children would outrank every noble family in England. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between them, in the liminal space where desperation meets ambition. Whatever words were spoken, whatever glances were exchanged, whatever trembled in the air between them in those quiet French chambers was powerful enough to make both of them cross a threshold from which there was no return. They married in secret, without witness or permission. Their union sealed not with political strategy, but with a shared defiance that pulsed like wildfire through their veins. In that moment, Mary claimed her freedom and Charles claimed his future, and both believed without admitting it aloud that Henry's love would save them. But love bends only so far before it snaps. When news of the marriage reached Henry, the explosion shook the court like a thunderclap. The king, who had slaughtered men for far less betrayal, felt the old wounds of childhood insecurities rip open, the betrayal of trust hitting him with a ferocity that no diplomat could soften. The court trembled as Henry's fury grew so white-hot that his counselors prepared the paperwork for Brandon's execution. Because the law was clear, marrying a royal without the king's permission was treason punishable by death. And not even Henry's affection should have been able to shield him from the fate he had invited upon himself. But Charles Brandon had one weapon left. Something stronger than charm, stronger even than ambition. He knew how to beg in a way that broke a king's resolve. From France, he sent letters so drenched in despair that even hardened counselors found their fingers trembling as they unfolded them. Letters in which he called himself a fool, a traitor, an unworthy creature. Letters in which he offered his life, his lands, his fortune, his future, asking only that Henry spare his head. And Mary wrote as well, claiming the blame, pleading as a sister rather than a queen, reminding Henry of the promise he had once made her, pressing upon him the unbearable truth that if Charles died, she would be responsible for his blood. Those letters became the hinge on which Brandon's life turned. They softened the king's rage just enough to carve out a narrow path to mercy, a mercy lined with punishment so severe it would have broken any other man. But Charles Brandon accepted it because the alternative was the cold kiss of the executioner's blade, and for the first time in his life, he truly understood that surviving Henry VIII required sacrifices far greater than pride, and thus began the long shadow that would follow him forever. The storm that followed Charles Brandon back to England after the forbidden marriage was not merely a political tempest, but a shifting of the very ground beneath his feet, because he returned not as the dazzling companion who had once moved effortlessly through the king's orbit, but as a man weighed down by the knowledge that every corridor he walked through might be the one leading to his imprisonment. Every whisper behind him might be the murmur of guards preparing chains, and every glance aimed his way might be a silent judgment from a court that had long waited for his fall. The palace air, usually thick with scent and chatter, felt dense and brittle, like the hush before lightning strikes. For everyone understood that Henry's rage was a creature unlike anything they had seen before. Something too vast to be measured by precedent, something volatile enough to annihilate years of loyalty with a single command. Henry's fury, when Brandon finally stood before him, was not loud or theatrical but cold in a way that sank under the skin, because betrayal had always been the king's deepest fear. The wound left unhealed by a childhood spent watching alliances shift like sand. And now that wound had reopened at the hand of the one man he had believed incapable of turning against him. Yet even in the thick of that fury, something stayed Henry's hand, something fragile and irrational that no advisor could predict or influence. Something lodged deep within the king's memory of the boy he had grown up with, the companion who had once ridden beside him when the world felt bright and unbroken. It was that faint thread of brotherhood, almost eroded by power and jealousy and pride, that prevented Henry from ordering an immediate execution. But mercy did not come freely, and the cost extracted from Brandon would carve scars across his life that would never fully heal. The punishments imposed upon him were staggering, designed not only to humiliate him, but to wipe away the foundation he had built through years of carefully maintained proximity to the throne. Henry levied against him a fine so immense it surpassed nearly every private debt recorded in the kingdom. A sum meant to cripple his fortune, force him into dependence, and remind him that his survival was no longer a privilege he carried, but a debt he owed. Brandon forfeited lands that had once symbolized his rise from obscurity, estates that held the memory of triumph and the illusion of permanence, estates handed out to others as quiet proof that the king's generosity had limits. He surrendered Mary's French dowry, the very wealth that had been hers by right, the wealth that might have cushioned their descent, and returned it entirely to the crown. A gesture that stripped their marriage of its financial security before it even had the chance to root itself in ordinary life. Yet it was not the material penalties that cut deepest, but the ritual humiliation Henry required before allowing Brandon to return to the world. The Duke, who had once strutted across tournament grounds with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, now stood in public as a supplicant, confessing his error before men who had despised him for years, bowing low to the very rivals who had long prayed for this moment, allowing the court to see him bent, diminished, forced to swallow the pride that had been both his crown and his curse. He withdrew from court afterward, not exiled by decree but by expectation, because Henry needed time to cool the fury that had threatened to consume his oldest companion. And the court needed time to adjust to the version of Charles Brandon who had returned a man bruised but alive, a man who had fallen from the king's grace, yet somehow not been destroyed by the fall. In those quiet months away from the seat of power, Brandon and Mary settled into a life more intimate than either of them had ever known. A life marked not by political performances, but by the strange intimacy of two people learning what it meant to share a future that neither had planned, but both had chosen in defiance of a monarch. Their days carried a nervous softness, layered with the awareness that the king's mood could shift again without warning, that their survival depended on their ability to remain insignificant for a while, almost invisible to the tensions rising in London as Henry navigated the breakdown of his first marriage, the theological battles unfolding across Europe, and the whispers of discontent that swirled around his desire for a male heir. Amid those upheavals, the outrage over Mary and Charles began to fade, replaced by new crises, new gossip, new threats. Because in a court ruled by Henry VIII, scandal had a short memory and danger had many faces. Slowly, cautiously, Charles was allowed to reappear in the king's presence, not in the familiar role of beloved companion, but as a subdued figure who understood that the margin for error had shrunk to the width of a blade. Henry welcomed him back with a carefully moderated warmth, the kind that looked like forgiveness, but was actually a recalibration, a decision to keep Brandon close enough to monitor, but not close enough to trust. Their interactions were marked by a new stiffness, a thin veil of formality draped across the remnants of what had once been easy companionship. Because Henry, despite allowing Charles to live, had never forgotten the sting of betrayal, and Charles felt that knowledge in every breath he took near the king. He adjusted quickly, instinctively, learning how to navigate this new version of the man he had once known intimately, sensing the sharpness that had crept into Henry's temper, the paranoia that flickered beneath his smiles, the growing hunger for control that would one day spiral into something monstrous. Charles became quieter, more deliberate, careful to measure his words, careful to avoid opinions that might brush against Henry's insecurities, careful to never again suggest by tone or posture or presence that he might possess a life independent of the king's will. He had survived the impossible, but survival had cost him the last remnants of equality that once existed between them. Yet beneath this new caution lay a more subtle transformation, one that would define the rest of his life. Brandon began to see, with startling clarity, how dangerous Henry could become when the illusion of loyalty fractured. He witnessed how swiftly affection could turn to suspicion, how easily admiration transformed into rage when the king's desires were thwarted, and how thoroughly Henry could weaponize the law, the church, and the court to achieve whatever outcome satisfied his shifting emotions. He watched as Catherine of Aragon endured the slow disintegration of her marriage, as the king grew consumed by the need for a male heir, as the first cracks in the relationship between Henry and Rome widened into a schism that would reshape the kingdom, and he understood that the age of playful youth had ended, replaced by a political climate so volatile that even a breath out of place might invite catastrophe. Mary, who had long sensed the world's instability, seemed to shrink under the weight of these transformations, her health fluctuating in the years that followed, her heart caught between her loyalty to her brother and her sorrow over the unraveling of the faith she had been raised to revere. Charles stood by her through these waves of uncertainty, yet he could feel the sands shifting under both their feet, as though their marriage, born of defiance, was now tethered to a future none of their choices could fully control. The shadow of Henry's disapproval lingered over them, even as time softened its edges, and Brandon lived each day acutely aware that fortune had granted him only one reprieve and would not offer another should he ever again provoke the king's wrath. The life Charles rebuilt in these years was shaped not by triumph, but by caution, by the knowledge that the king's forgiveness was a privilege with an expiration date, by the recognition that the tether binding him to Henry was no longer the rope of brotherhood, but the chain of mutual need. Henry kept him close because Brandon could still serve him, could still make him look strong, could still anchor memories of a youth that the king, now older and heavier with responsibility, clung to whenever fear or ambition clouded his vision. And Charles accepted this role, not because he desired it, but because his survival depended on it, because he had glimpsed the place where disobedience leads and had no desire to ever stand there again. Thus he lived, not as the man he had once been, but as the man he was forced to become, waiting for the next storm Henry would unleash upon the court, unaware that the greatest rupture of the king's life was approaching, a rupture that would divide the kingdom, shatter families, and pull Charles Brandon into conflicts that would demand not only obedience, but complicity. The years that followed Mary's gradual withdrawal from public life marked a turning point not only for her, but for Charles Brandon as well, because the kingdom around them was beginning to shudder under the weight of Henry's transformation, a shift that altered the very air within the palaces, a thickening, tightening, suffocating tension that warned every courtier that the king's patience, once a long and flexible thread, had become fragile, frayed, and quick to snap at the slightest pressure. What had once been a court of youthful bravado and glittering displays of pageantry was now a place ruled by introspection laced with terror, a realm where the king's desire for legacy collided with the brutal truth that Catherine of Aragon could no longer give him the son he demanded. And this collision unleashed a storm that would reach every corner of Charles Brandon's life, even before he recognized he had stepped into its path. At first, the king's discontent manifested quietly, in the restless pacing of nights, in the long pauses during council sessions when Henry stared into some unfathomable future only he could see, in the fragile way he clung to the idea that only a male heir could secure the Tudor line, an idea so deeply wired into his sense of destiny that nothing, not love, not loyalty, not religious doctrine, could stand against it. Charles watched this growing unrest with the uneasy attentiveness of a man who had learned to read the king's internal storms before they broke into thunder, and he sensed something shifting beneath Henry's skin, an impatience so profound it would soon demand a sacrifice far greater than the kingdom had ever been asked to bear. The pivot came slowly, first as murmurs about the king's doubts regarding his marriage, murmurs that spread through the corridors like smoke, then as formal questions regarding the legitimacy of Catherine's union with Henry, questions dressed in theological clothing but stitched together with political desperation. Charles, still precariously rebuilding his position after his forbidden marriage, understood at once that this was a subject he could not afford to wade into, because Henry's anxieties were now so intimate and volatile that even the gentlest disagreement could be mistaken for betrayal, and he remained outwardly neutral, offering neither counsel nor resistance, choosing instead the safety of silence. But silence in those days was not always enough. When Anne Boleyn rose into the king's orbit like a flame drawn toward a starved wick, Charles felt the temperature of the court change with a violence that seemed unreal. Because Anne's arrival did not simply shift allegiances, it severed them. She hovered around the king with a confidence that bordered on defiance, refusing to succumb to the traditional expectations of royal mistresses, refusing to be merely an ornament, refusing to allow Henry to consume her without consequence. She demanded marriage, demanded status, demanded that the king not only break with Catherine, but tear apart the very spiritual foundations of England, if that was what it took to place a crown upon her head. And Henry, intoxicated by her sharp wit, her independence, her refusal to yield, allowed his world to reorganize itself around her. For Charles, this ascent was catastrophic, not in its political implications, but in its personal cost. Because he despised Anne with a vehemence that burned hotter than the resentment of the old nobility. She embodied everything that threatened the fragile balance he had worked so hard to maintain. She was ambitious, calculating, and unafraid to call out men she believed unworthy of their positions. And she viewed Charles as a relic of the king's reckless youth, a man whose influence she intended to strip away the moment her power was secure. Their animosity did not stem from petty court politics, but from something deeper, more instinctive, a clash of natures forged by incompatible beliefs about loyalty, merit, and the rightful place of those who ascended through charm rather than lineage. Anne saw Charles as an opportunist who had coasted too long on the king's affection, a man who played at nobility without possessing its blood, and she made no effort to conceal her contempt, mocking him at feasts, slighting him in council, ignoring him altogether when she believed she could do so without consequence. Charles, in turn, found her insufferable, convinced that she had bewitched the king with a dangerous blend of manipulation and allure, convinced that her rise would bring ruin not only to Catherine, but to the delicate equilibrium that had kept Henry tethered to the world beyond his desires. Yet what Charles feared most was not Anne's ambition, but the way the king responded to it. Because Henry, once a ruler who valued camaraderie, now bristled with a new intensity, a willingness to sever relationships that no longer served him, a willingness to challenge any voice that did not echo his own. The king who had wept at Catherine's early miscarriages, who had once cherished Mary Tudor's quiet devotion, who had once laughed freely with Brandon beneath the bright banners of youth, was fading into someone sharper, colder, more certain of his own infallibility. Charles felt himself losing the ability to predict Henry's reactions, and this loss terrified him more than exile or execution ever could. Because without that instinct, he was nothing more than another courtier navigating a maze of invisible tripwires. The break with Rome, when it finally came, shattered whatever illusion remained of the king's restraint. It was not simply a political realignment, but a spiritual convulsion that tore through the kingdom with the force of a tidal wave, drowning priests in uncertainty, dragging nobles into factions, dividing families along lines of belief that had been unalterable for generations. Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, announcing a sovereignty so absolute it left no room for doubt or dissent. And from that proclamation radiated a new understanding of power. The king was no longer bound by tradition, morality, or external authority. He was answerable only to his own conscience, and a conscience shaped by desire is a dangerous thing. For Charles, this shift created a landscape so treacherous that even standing still felt like a risk. Anne's ascendancy had emboldened those who saw in the king's transformation an opportunity to reshape England's future, while those loyal to Catherine whispered about divine retribution and the unraveling of civilization itself. Brandon, who had once been able to navigate differing factions by appealing to camaraderie and shared memories, now found himself caught between forces that viewed neutrality as an act of treason, and he maintained his position only by becoming more careful, more observant, more malleable than he had ever been before. He watched as Catherine was cast aside, not with the swift cruelty of execution, but with the slow cruelty of erasure, stripped of her title, her household, her place at court, and confined to a lonely existence that felt more like exile than retirement. He watched as Princess Mary, once a cherished symbol of the Tudor future, was declared illegitimate, forced to bow before the woman who had taken her mother's place, a humiliation that spread across the kingdom like a wound no one dared to acknowledge. And through it all, Charles held his tongue, bearing his sympathy beneath layers of caution, because expressing anything other than agreement with the king's decisions was no longer just unwise, it was suicidal. The court's atmosphere thickened with fear. Not the sharp, swift fear of battlefield danger, but the slow, expanding fear of living beneath a ruler whose pleasure could shift to wrath without warning. Charles felt this change in the way his own heart behaved around Henry, beating faster not in excitement but in apprehension, a visceral reminder that the man he had grown up with had transformed into someone whose approval was no longer a refuge, but a fragile shield. Yet even as he sensed the danger, he also sensed the strange dependence Henry still held for him, a dependence rooted not in trust, but in the king's memory of who he had once been, a memory only Charles could still access. And then Anne Boleyn finally won her crown, and the fabric of England tore open. When Anne Boleyn finally settled onto the English throne, the transformation of the court did not unfold through proclamations or ceremonies, but through a subtle hardening of the air itself, a tightening of glances, a sharpening of whispers, a rearranging of loyalties that moved like a quiet tide reshaping the shoreline. And Charles Brandon, standing at the edges of these shifting currents, felt the old world he once understood dissolving beneath his feet with a steadiness that unsettled even his seasoned instincts. The woman he despised now occupied a position so central that any misstep in her presence could entangle him in dangers far larger than personal grudges. Because Anne was no longer the clever lady-in-waiting with sharp wit and sharper temper. She had become the axis of Henry's desire, the vessel of his hopes for a male heir, the queen who expected absolute obedience from every figure beneath the crown's shadow. And with her coronation came the collapse of the last remnants of familiarity, because the king who once laughed beside Charles now moved with a sense of destiny that left no room for the soft indulgences of youth. Anne's court glowed with a brilliance that masked its volatility, filled with musicians and poets and foreign diplomats who sought her favor. Yet beneath the gilded splendor lay a constant sense of siege, because she knew her rise had carved deep wounds into the kingdom, wounds that would never heal. Catherine still lived, displaced and grieving, and the populace whispered prayers for her in chapels across the country, seeing in her suffering the unraveling of the natural order. Princess Mary, stripped of her title and forced into a household commanded by Anne's allies, became the living reminder that Anne's crown rested upon the ruins of another woman's life, and every noble family who had once sworn loyalty to Catherine now watched Anne with a skepticism that bordered on quiet rebellion. Charles had no love for Anne, but even he could see the impossible burden she carried, because her crown was not a symbol of triumph, but of expectation. A crown weighted with the demand to produce a son who could silence every critic, stabilize every faction, and secure the king's legacy. For Henry, the early months of Anne's queenship were marked by a fervor that burned bright enough to blind him to the tensions he was stoking across his realm. And Charles observed this fervor with the uneasy awareness that the king's passion was no longer carefree devotion, but a fever that demanded fulfillment. Henry spoke of destiny as though he had glimpsed it in dreams, pacing with restless energy as he imagined the son who would one day rule England with a strength that surpassed his own. And he pressed this hope onto Anne with relentless intensity, turning her body into the battleground upon which the kingdom's security would be decided. Every pregnancy brought waves of anticipation that surged through the court, and every miscarriage struck the king with a disappointment so deep it rippled outward, straining alliances, fueling rumors, and magnifying Anne's vulnerability. Charles watched this drama unfold with a mixture of disdain and caution, because although he harbored no affection for Anne, he understood better than most how dangerous it was to stand too close to a collapsing star. He kept his distance, more from prudence than malice, yet even distance could not fully shield him. Because Anne's dislike for him had fermented into something personal and corrosive, she considered him a relic of Henry's past, a stubborn reminder of a phase in the king's life she sought to bury. And she pressed Henry to limit Brandon's influence, to assign him tasks that removed him from court, to reduce the closeness that had once seemed unbreakable between the king and his childhood companion. Henry, however, bristled at being guided so directly, and though he complied in small gestures, the deeper instinct to keep Charles nearby never fully faded, creating a tension between husband and wife that simmered beneath the surface of their marriage. The fracture widened as Anne's pregnancies came and went, each loss amplifying the whispers that she had been cursed, that God disapproved of the king's separation from Catherine, that the crown had been placed upon the wrong woman's head. These murmurs traveled like smoke through the great halls, curling under doors and around tapestries, reaching even the ears of Henry's enemies in foreign courts, who took pleasure in the idea that the English king might suffer under the weight of his own choices. Charles did not speak of these rumors, but he absorbed them, storing them in the quiet spaces of his mind where instinct warned him that the kingdom was entering a new phase of unpredictability, one in which even those closest to the king would be required to choose carefully when to breathe and when to hold their breath. Anne, sensing the walls closing around her, grew sharper in her dealings, more defensive, more intolerant of perceived slights, and her interactions with Charles became icy battlegrounds where even a polite bow carried the tension of a duel. Brandon responded with carefully measured neutrality, using silence as his shield, allowing neither his contempt nor his caution to surface openly, because he knew that anything he said in Anne's presence might be twisted into an accusation or weaponized in a moment of her frustration. Yet he could not stop the currents that were pulling the court toward crisis, because Anne's inability to give Henry the son he craved was not a matter of personality or strategy, but fate, and fate was indifferent to the frailties of queens. The breaking point arrived with a ferocity that stunned even the most cynical courtiers, because it did not begin with grand gestures, but with a miscarriage, one that occurred at a moment of heightened political stress, a moment when Henry's fears about succession were already gnawing at him with merciless hunger. The grief that struck Anne was overshadowed entirely by the disappointment that consumed the king. And Charles, standing at the periphery of this implosion, recognized instantly that the tide had turned not only against Anne, but against anyone who had positioned themselves too closely to her. The delicate balance that had once defined court politics shifted sharply, and the factions that had long opposed Anne began to move with a coordination that suggested not spontaneity, but orchestration, as though someone had been waiting for this exact crack in the queen's armor to unleash forces too large for her to resist. Brandon felt the change in Henry's gaze before he heard a single word from the king's lips. The warmth that once lived there had cooled into something like resignation, the kind of resignation that precedes decisions meant to reshape the world rather than the heart, decisions that demand sacrifice no matter how deeply they cut. Anne sensed it too, clawing at her remaining influence, summoning her wit in desperate attempts to rekindle the spark that had once bound Henry to her. But the king, now older, heavier, and hardened by years of political turmoil, had no patience left for defiance or disappointment. The storm that descended upon Anne moved swiftly, carrying accusations that multiplied with alarming speed, accusations of adultery, treason, and acts so grotesque that even Charles, who had wished for her downfall, felt a ripple of unease as he listened to the charges unfold, because he understood, perhaps more than most, that Anne's guilt was less a matter of truth and more a matter of necessity. The king needed closure, needed an enemy, needed a narrative that justified the destruction he was about to unleash. And the court, eager to survive, became eager to comply. Through the chaos, Charles Brandon kept his distance, not out of principle, but out of instinct, because he recognized that the collapse of Anne Boleyn was not merely the fall of a queen, but the unveiling of a truth he had been unwilling to face for years. Henry was no longer a man governed by relationships or emotions, but by the unrelenting machinery of his own will. And those who stood in the path of that machinery, whether queens or ministers or childhood friends, would eventually be crushed beneath it. But what Charles did not yet realize, as Anne's world crumbled around her and factions scrambled to realign themselves in the shifting political winds, was that this moment, the destruction of a woman he had long resented, would mark the beginning of a new and far more perilous chapter in his own survival. Because the king who had once spared him out of love was now becoming a man who spared no one out of fear. The collapse of Anne Boleyn unfolded with such chilling precision that even those who had long anticipated her downfall found themselves stunned by the speed with which her world disintegrated. Because once the king's affection evaporated, every gesture he had ever made toward her, the poems, the feasts, the promises, the revolution of religion itself seemed to dissolve into the cold fog that now settled over the English court. Charles Brandon watched from the tenuous safety of a man who had learned through painful experience that proximity to a dying star was lethal, and he understood better than most that Anne's fate had been sealed the moment Henry's hope for a male heir turned into despair. But even he, who had despised her sharpness and ambition, felt a grim recognition in her unraveling, as though he were staring at a reflection of what might happen to any soul who believed the king's affection could protect them indefinitely. The arrest began quietly, with whispers and summonses that carried an eerie sense of inevitability, and before the court could fully register the shift, the Queen's closest companions found themselves dragged into interrogations that blurred the line between suspicion and invention. Men who had once been welcome at the edges of Anne's circle were suddenly accused of crimes so outlandish that Charles could only marvel at how swiftly reputations could be twisted into weapons. He recognized in these charges a familiar pattern, the same pattern that had once threatened to consume him when the king wanted an outcome. Facts bent until they snapped. Truth reshaped itself to serve royal need, and guilt became a matter of narrative rather than evidence. Anne herself was taken with a mixture of dignity and disbelief, carried to the Tower not as a queen but as a prisoner, accompanied by guards whose eyes revealed nothing, because in the England of Henry VIII, neutrality was the only safe expression when a royal life was being appraised for disposal. Charles watched her departure from a distance, cloaked in silence, and although he felt no sorrow for her personally, he felt a tremor through the structure of power itself, a tremor that signaled the monarchy had crossed another threshold, a threshold where wives could be discarded as swiftly as garments, where loyalty evaporated the moment it inconvenienced the crown, where fear had become the marrow of every decision. The trial that followed was not a search for truth, but a performance, staged with all the trappings of justice, yet devoid of its spirit. Witnesses were prepared, confessions coaxed or coerced, testimonies sculpted into narratives of betrayal that fit neatly into the king's growing hunger for order in his own life. Charles did not attend the proceedings, but he heard enough from those who did to understand that Anne's fate had been sealed long before the first accusation left anyone's mouth. Her enemies circled with newfound boldness. Her allies retreated into shadows, and the court, as courts always do, shifted its weight toward the rising wind. When the verdict was announced, there was no shock, only the hollow echo of inevitability. Anne Boleyn, once the woman who had captivated the king so completely that he had shattered his kingdom for her, would be executed by the clean stroke of a sword brought specially from France. Charles, who had once despised her so deeply that he believed her triumph had signaled the end of everything familiar, now found her execution strangely haunting, not because he pitied her, but because he saw in her fate the shadow of every person who had ever stood too close to the king's desires. Her death was not merely the fall of a queen, but the reminder that Henry's love, once unconditional, had become a blade that cut without hesitation. On the morning of her execution, the Tower grounds were weighted with a stillness that felt unnatural, as though the very stone held its breath. Charles remained distant from the spectacle, but the details traveled through the corridors within hours, Anne stepping onto the scaffold with poise that belied the chaos of her final days, her quiet acceptance of the king's will, her strange insistence on praising Henry in her final speech, as though the only legacy she could claim in that moment was her ability to protect her daughter by masking her pain in grace. It struck Charles that Anne, in those final breaths, revealed more strength than she had ever displayed at court. An acceptance not of guilt, but of the futility of resisting a force as absolute as Henry's will. The sword fell with a swiftness that silenced even the ravens perched along the tower walls. And in that silence, the court felt something shift irrevocably. Anne's death did not bring relief. It brought a realization that no one, not wives, not counselors, not childhood companions, was immune from the king's capacity to sever ties with frightening efficiency. Charles felt this truth settle over him like frost, reminding him that his survival in this world depended not only on avoiding mistakes, but on predicting the emotional storms of a man who now saw himself as chosen by destiny, untouched by earthly constraints. In the days that followed, as Jane Seymour emerged into the role Anne had once seized with such ferocity, Charles observed a new pattern forming in Henry's behavior, a pattern of yearning coupled with exhaustion, the yearning for a quiet, compliant presence to soothe the turmoil his choices had unleashed, and the exhaustion of a man who had spent years bending the world until it cracked. Jane represented a balm, a return to the gentleness Henry once associated with Catherine, and Charles, sensing the shift, understood immediately that the king's temperament was moving toward a more subdued phase, one that still held danger, but in a colder, more controlled form. Yet even this shift did not diminish the cracks spreading through the kingdom. The execution of Anne Boleyn sent ripples through England's religious landscape, emboldening some, terrifying others, casting doubt on the stability of a throne that seemed to devour those closest to it. Charles watched with the weary insight of someone who had already witnessed the cost of standing too close to power and knew that the court would never again return to the careless exuberance of Henry's early years. Henry, for all his triumphs, now carried an aura of isolation, a man surrounded by noise yet profoundly alone. And in this isolation, Charles found himself drawn back into the king's orbit with renewed caution. Their interactions regained the appearance of familiarity, but the closeness lacked the ease it once had, replaced by a quiet tension that Charles could neither break nor ignore. He learned to offer comfort without opinion, presence without expectation, loyalty without attachment, because any misalignment could be perceived as disloyalty in a world where the king's temper had become as unpredictable as the tides. Meanwhile, Charles's own life entered a period of transition marked by the decline of Mary, whose health continued to falter under the weight of grief for Catherine, fear for her niece Elizabeth, and exhaustion from the emotional storms that had consumed the court. Charles, who had once held on to their marriage as the boldest proof of his defiance, now watched helplessly as the woman he had risked everything to claim slipped gradually into frailty, her spirit dimming under the burden of a world she felt powerless to change. Her death, and when it came, was quiet but devastating, leaving him with a grief he did not expect and a sense of emptiness that surprised even him. Yet before that grief could fully settle, the court demanded his presence, because Henry needed companions who could stabilize the shifting sands beneath his feet. And Charles understood with unsettling clarity that he could not withdraw into mourning without risking the king's suspicion. He returned to his duties with the steadiness of a man who had learned to compartmentalize loss. But something inside him had changed, a softening in the spaces he had once hardened for survival, a recognition that even the boldest gamblers eventually run out of things to wager. As Jane Seymour's quiet presence began reshaping the palace atmosphere, Charles sensed the flicker of calm returning to the court. But beneath that calm lay another truth he could not ignore: the king's hunger for control, for legacy, for absolute certainty, was growing sharper, and the court was balancing on a precipice without realizing how shallow the footing had become. What Charles could not yet know was that the next upheaval, the one that would shake the kingdom to its core, would arrive not through ambition or betrayal, but through birth and death entwined, and that this new chapter, far from granting peace, would plunge him deeper into the machinery of survival than he had ever ventured before. The birth of Prince Edward should have been the moment when the kingdom exhaled, when years of tension finally loosened, when Henry's spiraling anxieties, sharpened by loss and disappointment, found a place to rest. Yet what followed instead was a convergence of triumph and tragedy, so tightly bound that the court struggled to distinguish celebration from mourning, because the arrival of the long-awaited male heir was swiftly overshadowed by the quiet unraveling of Queen Jane Seymour, the only woman who had ever managed to soothe the king's tempestuous nature with genuine gentleness. Charles Brandon, who had witnessed from the sidelines the emotional wreckage of Catherine and the destruction of Anne, approached this new chapter with the wary intuition of a man who had learned never to trust stability in a world governed by Henry's shifting desires. And as he watched the court erupt into jubilation, he sensed beneath the noise an almost imperceptible tremor that warned him the moment of peace would not last. Jane's decline began so subtly that the court initially mistook it for exhaustion. But within days, the unsettling truth emerged. Her body was failing in the wake of childbirth, and the joy that had filled the corridors of Hampton Court began to curdle into fear. Henry, dazzled by the grandeur of his new heir, seemed at first unwilling to acknowledge the severity of Jane's condition, clinging to the illusion that she would recover just as everything else in his life had eventually bent to his will. But Charles saw in the king's eyes the same shadow that had crossed them when Catherine miscarried, when Anne's hopes for a son dissolved in expression of dread wrapped in denial, a look that betrayed the fragility beneath Henry's growing self-image of invincibility. As Jane's condition worsened, the palace shifted into a strange limbo where celebration and mourning existed side by side, musicians rehearsing in one chamber while priests murmured prayers in another. And Charles found himself navigating these conflicting currents with the quiet resilience he had learned through decades of trauma. He visited the king cautiously, offering the familiar solidity Henry sought, but never naming the grief that was already settling over the royal household like a winter fog, because he understood that Henry could not bear to face it until the moment arrived. And until it did, the king required comfort, not truth. Charles had played this role before, standing near but never too close, offering presence without intrusion, providing companionship without demanding emotional clarity, and once again he stepped into it with the practiced gentleness of a man who had survived by anticipating needs unspoken. When Jane finally slipped from life, the news traveled through the palace in a hush so heavy it seemed to mute even the stone itself. Henry's grief erupted not in outward violence but in a collapse inward, a retreat into isolation so severe that even his closest attendants feared to approach him. And Charles, who had known the king for decades, recognized the danger in this silence, because Henry processed loss as though it were an affront to his authority, an insult from the universe, a reminder that there were forces in the world he could not command. The king's isolation grew thicker with each passing day, turning the palace into a mausoleum of unspoken emotions. And Charles understood that once Henry emerged from this state, he would carry with him a new hardness, a new distance, a new fear that would shape every decision that followed. For Charles himself, Jane's death reopened wounds he had kept buried in the quietest corners of his heart, because it reminded him painfully of the loss of Mary, a grief he had never fully allowed himself to acknowledge, overshadowed as it had been by political necessity and the unrelenting demands of survival. Now, witnessing the king's despair, he felt the echo of his own, a shared sorrow that momentarily bridged the widening gulf between them. Yet even this fragile connection could not restore the closeness they had once known. Too much had happened. Too many lines had been crossed. Too many transformations had reshaped Henry into a figure Charles could no longer predict with the same certainty that had once anchored his life. As the court adjusted to the new reality, the infant prince motherless, the king cloaked in mourning, the nation uncertain of how to navigate its grief, Charles found himself stepping into a role he had not anticipated, a stabilizing force for nobles who feared what Henry's sorrow might become, and for servants who whispered about the ominous weight settling over the realm. He moved with deliberate calm, lending his authority where needed, offering his presence as a reminder that the world, though shaken, had not entirely collapsed. In these weeks, something in him softened, not out of sentiment, but out of a dawning awareness that survival alone was no longer enough. He had lived through too many storms, witnessed too many downfalls, and the time had come to find meaning in the spaces where fear once governed every breath. Yet the world outside the palace did not pause for private grief. Foreign powers watched closely, assessing the stability of England's succession. Reformers and traditionalists resumed their wrestling for influence over the spiritual identity of the kingdom. And within the council chambers, subtle shifts in power began to take shape as factions sensed opportunity in the king's emotional vulnerability. Charles observed these movements with the tightened focus of a man who had learned the cost of standing on the wrong side of political currents. And he recognized that the years ahead would demand a different kind of navigation, not the bold gambles of his youth, but the quiet, steady endurance of a seasoned survivor. Henry, once he emerged from mourning, seemed drained of the vitality that had once defined him, as though a portion of his spirit had been buried with Jane. His conversations became shorter, his temper more unpredictable, his expectations more rigid, and Charles found himself walking once again on a razor's edge, careful to offer companionship without provoking irritation, careful to maintain proximity without appearing indispensable. For the loss of Jane had awakened in Henry a new fear of loneliness, fear of mortality, fear that fate might yet deny him the legacy he had fought so ruthlessly to secure, and these fears made him cling to control with renewed ferocity. The king's search for a new wife began earlier than propriety dictated, driven not by desire, but by the pragmatic need to secure the succession further. And Charles observed this process with cautious neutrality, offering neither support nor objection, because he knew the danger of aligning himself too clearly with any candidate. He had learned that queens rose and fell on the sharp edges of royal expectations, and he refused to bind his fate to any woman who might one day find herself staring at the tower walls. Instead, he positioned himself as a figure of quiet constancy, a man who served the crown without inserting himself into the emotional or political battles that accompanied each new potential marriage. As Henry's health began its gradual decline marked by increasing weight, persistent leg ulcers, and the weariness of a man carrying too many contradictions, Charles saw with startling clarity that the era of their youth was now irretrievably gone. The king he had once raced across fields with, the king he had once shared jokes and dreams with, had been replaced by a figure shaped by loss, ambition, regret, and the crushing burden of his own choices. Yet even as Henry changed, Charles remained bound to him, not by affection anymore, but by something heavier, a shared history, a sense of obligation, and the knowledge that any attempt to distance himself could be misinterpreted as betrayal. In these years, Charles began to understand the full cost of survival because he saw that the closer he remained to Henry, the more he was forced to surrender the pieces of himself that once defined him: the boldness, the humor, the reckless confidence, the ability to act on his own desires. Now, everything he did was measured, calculated, shaped by the need to navigate the fragile terrain of a king who still needed him, but no longer trusted anyone fully. And yet, amidst all this, Charles found himself slowly stepping into a quieter form of wisdom, recognizing that although he had risen to power through charm and daring, he would survive its final chapter only through patience, subtlety, and the acceptance that he would forever walk beside a man whose love had always been a double-edged sword. What Charles could not yet foresee was how near he stood to the final turn of the road, how close he was to the end of his own story, and how deeply his death, when it came, would echo in the hollow chambers of a king who would outlive him, but would never again find a companion capable of reflecting the boy he once had been. But for now, Brandon continued onward, unaware that the final chapter was already approaching, carried quietly toward him by time's relentless advance, waiting to close its hand around a life lived on the blade of another man's will. In the final stretch of Charles Brandon's life, the world around him seemed to contract, as though the corridors of the great palaces he had once raced through were shrinking into narrower and narrower paths, leaving him with only the echo of memories that no longer belonged to the man he had become. Henry, aging rapidly and sinking further into the heaviness of his own regrets, clung to fragments of the past like a man reaching for driftwood on a churning sea. Yet even in his most vulnerable moments, he remained unpredictable, his temper as volatile as ever, his mood shifting with the same restlessness that had shaped every shattered marriage and every broken alliance. Charles, now older, more tired, and carrying the weight of decades spent bending himself to the king's desires, found that his once effortless ability to navigate Henry's emotional world was beginning to falter. Not because he had forgotten the cues, but because Henry himself had changed in ways that no longer followed recognizable patterns, as though grief and illness had scrambled the logic of the man Charles once knew. The king's declining health cast a pall over the court, creating an atmosphere thick with unease. Because the truth that no one dared voice aloud hung in every chamber, Henry was dying, and with his death would come a reckoning that frightened even those who had long awaited the transition. The ulcer on his leg festered with a stench that seeped into fabrics and clung to stone. His breath came in strained gasps, his once imposing figure now swollen and immobile. Yet his mind still flickered with the old fire, demanding obedience, demanding reassurance, demanding the illusion that he remained invincible. Charles approached him with the same cautious reverence that had preserved his life for so long. But beneath the practiced steadiness of his voice, he felt a tremor he could not fully suppress. A recognition that the king who had once been his companion in youth had become a monument to his own contradictions. A man consumed by the weight of a legacy built on destruction, ambition, and the fragile hope that a single son could carry the burden of everything he had broken. As the court moved through these last uneasy years, Charles found himself increasingly aware of the distance between his younger self and the man who now walked the palace halls as though moving through a dream he no longer believed in. The memories of tournaments and midnight feasts and laughter in sunlit courtyards had become fragments scattered across a landscape he barely recognized, and Henry, ravaged by time and illness, seemed to oscillate between clinging to Charles as the last living relic of his youth and turning against him with the suspicion that had consumed so many before. Yet even in his worst tempers, Henry never fully severed the bond, because Brandon represented something that no other courtier could give him: a window into the boy he had once been. The boy who believed the world could be shaped by charm and courage rather than fear and blood. Charles's own decline began quietly, as all such declines do, with small moments of exhaustion that did not fade, with aches that lingered longer than they should, with a sense of heaviness that filtered into every part of him, dulling the instincts he had once relied upon for survival. He was no longer the vibrant duke who commanded the tilt yard or the man who navigated court intrigue with effortless grace. He was a figure worn down by decades of service, by emotional contortions that had slowly eroded his soul, by losses that had carved hollows inside him. And yet, for all these burdens, he still carried himself with a dignity that surprised those who had expected him to crumble under Henry's hardening will. Because Charles had learned long ago that survival depended not on strength, but on adaptability, a skill he had mastered to the point that it had become second nature. As his health worsened, he began withdrawing from the relentless rhythms of court life, spending more time on his estates, surrounded by the quiet he had never been allowed to cultivate in his youth. In these peaceful hours, he found himself reflecting on the long arc of his life, on the choices he had made, on the people he had loved and lost, on the moments when he had stood at the edge of annihilation and somehow stepped back from it. He thought of Mary, whose memory still touched him with a gentleness that no ambition could erase, and he wondered whether the reckless gamble that had bound their fates together had been worth the cost, not because he regretted her, but because he finally understood how fragile the threads of life truly were. He thought of Henry, not as the king who had terrorized a nation, but as the boy he had once known, the boy with laughter in his eyes and dreams too large for the world to hold. And he felt a pang of sorrow for the man Henry had become, trapped within the fortress of his own creation, surrounded by fear rather than love. The end, when it came, was not dramatic but quiet, almost merciful, as though the world itself had softened in recognition of how long he had walked its most treacherous paths. Charles slipped away in his bed, surrounded not by armed guards or political enemies, but by the stillness of a life finally releasing its grip. The news of his death reached Henry with a force that shook him in ways no rebellion or betrayal ever had, because for the first time he faced the undeniable truth that the last living witness to his youth, the last companion who had known him before the crown hardened him, the last man who dared to look at the monstrous king and still remember the boy, was gone. Henry's grief was a strange and complicated thing, shaped by a lifetime of contradictions, love mixed with resentment, loyalty twisted by fear, affection tangled with guilt, and those who watched him in the days after Brandon's death saw a man momentarily stripped of his grandeur. A man mourning not only his friend, but the version of himself that Charles had preserved simply by existing. In that grief lay the quiet realization that no amount of power could turn back the tide of time, that no decree could bring back the faces that had once shaped his world, that no legacy, however grand, could fill the hollowness left by the absence of those who had walked beside him when life was still full of promise. The court, sensing the depth of Henry's sorrow, moved with unusual gentleness around him, but the king himself seemed unable to reclaim the fragmented pieces of his spirit. His health deteriorated rapidly in the months that followed. His temper flared without warning. His isolation deepened, and many whispered that something in him had died with Charles Brandon, something intangible yet vital, the last fragile link to the humanity he had spent decades bearing beneath layers of authority and fear. When Henry finally died 2 years later, the kingdom mourned the sovereign but not the man, for the man had long been obscured by myth and terror. Yet in the private corners of memory, in the quiet recollections of those few who had known him before he became the figure history remembers, there lingered the faint echo of a friendship that had once illuminated the world, a friendship that had survived betrayal, exile, rage, and the relentless passage of time, a friendship that had defined the rise and fall of two men whose fates had been intertwined from childhood to death. In the end, Charles Brandon achieved what so many others could not. He survived Henry VIII not by outliving him in years, but by outlasting him in spirit. For his death came not at the blade of an executioner, but in the peace of his own bed, a quiet exit from a world that had demanded every compromise a man could make. And though history would remember him as a rogue, an opportunist, a survivor who bent with the winds of power, those who look deeper will see a man who walked the impossible line between loyalty and self-preservation, a man whose life revealed the true cost of loving a king who could never fully love anyone in return.